So as promised, in this video, we're going to consider the outcomes of changes in supply and demand and talk you through the process about how to predict what those outcomes would be and apply that process to any sort of new problem which would require that sort of analysis. So as this video is sort of a continuation of the previous video, I don't really have anything new to add here, but I do think that this is one of the more important videos which we'll have in this class. Okay, so outlined here is a four-step process for analyzing changes in the equilibrium price and quantity. So on the slides that come, we're going to go through each of these steps one by one and describe how you would go about conducting them. And then at the end, we're going to put them all together and go through a couple example problems to give you some experience analyzing changes in supply and demand and seeing what impact that would have on the market price and quantity of the good or service in question. Okay, so step one is draw the original supply and demand model. There are four sub-steps within this step, and you may think this seems incredibly basic and easy to remember, but I cannot tell you how many times we get to higher level classes and students forget some of these very basic fundamentals and rules of analyzing supply and demand. So the first step is always going to be drawing an L-shaped axis, which we'll do here in black. Okay, it's essential that we label this axis. So we're always going to have price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. And then we're going to have an upward sloping supply curve. We make sure we label it so we don't forget what is what. And a downward sloping demand curve. And remember that demand is always going to be downward sloping. In this class specifically, and in general in reality, it's almost always downward sloping. But it's going to be downward sloping because of the law of demand. But in case you ever get confused which one's upward sloping, which one goes down, remember that downward and demand both have D's in them. So hopefully that can be a mnemonic device for remembering that demand always goes down. Lastly, we want to consider our initial equilibrium. So we're going to draw a dashed line down and find our Q star and dashed line to the left and find our P star. So this is always going to be the first step in analyzing a supply and demand problem. So the second step is pretty straightforward. It's going to be consider whatever market force we're discussing, whatever market force you're presented with, and determine whether that market force is going to impact supply or whether it's going to impact demand. And so if it impacts demand, it's going to either affect the taste or popularity of the good or service, the population, the income, related good, or a expectation about the good in the future. And so we're basically determining whether it's the top row here or whether it's the bottom row. And the bottom row is the list of factors which impact supply from our previous video. And remember, if whatever factor is in consideration, whatever market force we're considering is impacting cost in any way, then it's going to impact supply. And so the second step of our four-step process is to determine whether the market force is impacting supply or impacting demand and making the choice between these two rows. The third step is also pretty straightforward, and it is to determine, once you know whether it is demand or whether it's supply that's changing, to determine if demand or supply are increasing or decreasing. And so then we are choosing columns. So we're saying, is it the left column or is it the right column? And when we combine that with choosing rows, then we're able to determine whether demand or supply changes and whether demand or supply increases or decreases. And once we do that, we pretty much have the problem figured out. Now, the last step is just tying it all together. So you want to go back to your original graph from step 1 and draw the new curve, which you determine in steps 2 or 3. So if you determine that the market force in consideration is leading to an increase in demand, then you're going to draw a demand curve which is to the right of the original demand curve. The next step is to draw the new equilibrium, find the new P star and Q star. And then the final step is to compare the new equilibrium price and quantity to the original equilibrium price and quantity. So on the next couple slides, we're going to go over a couple examples of how we would go about doing this. Okay, so let's think of a relatively simple example and think about what happens to the market price and quantity of salmon when the conditions for catching salmon are better than usual. So I love this example because I now live in Michigan and get to go salmon fishing in the Midwest. How wild is that? Pretty much that's something you used to only be able to do out in the Atlantic or the Pacific, but now over the past 70 years, we've been able to do that in Michigan. So returning to the actual point of this video, let's go through that 4-step process. So the first step is always to draw our original supply and demand. So we start off with our L-shaped axis. We draw P on the vertical axis. We draw Q on the horizontal axis. We have an upward sloping supply curve. We have a downward sloping demand curve. For these types of problems, for this type of just basic analysis, the slope, the shape of these curves really isn't going to matter too much. We just want to be developing our intuition about what happens qualitatively, what happens to the direction of price and quantity, not necessarily how much it changes. So once we have our curves labeled, we have our axes labeled, we have to label what the initial equilibrium is. And so remember a couple of videos ago I said we could use either Q star and P star or Q naught and P naught. I'm going to use the little 0 indicator here. So that's our first step. We're drawing our initial supply and demand graph. Second step is thinking about whether the market force, which is the conditions for catching salmon being better than usual, thinking about that and determining whether that impacts supply or demand. So does this market force refer to a change in the taste or preferences for salmon? No, it doesn't impact a related good. It doesn't impact the population of the people likely to buy salmon, doesn't impact the income of the people likely to buy salmon, and it doesn't really bear on any expectations about the future price of salmon or future availability of salmon. What it implies is that the conditions for catching salmon now are better than usual, that less effort is needed to be spent catching salmon to catch the same amount of salmon. So that is a clear example of a factor which would impact the cost of salmon production, which means that we're dealing with a change to the supply curve. Now, it's pretty straightforward in this example that we are not only looking at a change to the supply curve, but because the conditions for catching salmon are better than usual, it's easier to catch salmon. The production of salmon is becoming less costly, and so supply is going to shift to the right. So the final step then is to draw this new rightward shift in the supply curve on our original graph, indicate that supply is increasing, and find our new equilibrium quantity and find our new equilibrium price. So when there's an increase in supply, such as is the case here, we see price go down and quantity move to the right, quantity increase. So we know that there is more salmon available at a cheaper price. So we can predict, based on these conditions, that the price of salmon is going to decrease and there's going to be more salmon bought and sold. Now let's do another example where we think about the market price and quantity of printed media as our tastes become increasingly oriented towards digital media. So you can go along with me here. Hopefully you're doing this example on pen and paper. I can give you some time to grab that, or obviously you're watching this as a video so you can pause it. But our first step is always to draw the original supply and demand conditions, where we have an L-shaped axis with price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, an upward sloping supply curve, and a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, D for downward, D for demand. And we have an initial equilibrium quantity, and we have an initial equilibrium price. So we then read the prompt, read about the market force, and we see that we are referencing a change in tastes. That word should be a giveaway, so we know that we're dealing with the demand curve. And we want to know what happens to the market price and quantity of printed media as our tastes become oriented towards digital media. So it means that our tastes for printed media are decreasing as our tastes for digital media are increasing. So we know that the demand curve is being impacted, and we know that the demand for printed media is decreasing. So we're going to see a downward shift in our demand curve. Our demand curve is going to move to the left, which means that our equilibrium quantity is going to decrease, and our equilibrium price is going to decrease as well. So when there's a decrease in demand, then there is going to be less units of the good or service which are bought and sold, and they're going to be bought and sold at a lower price. So that is a prediction that you can make whenever you are faced with a situation where the demand is going to decrease. Okay, so in general, we want to stick with the rule of thumb that one change in a market force leads to one change in a supply or demand curve. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't analyze two changes at once and think about a shift of a demand curve and a supply curve at the same time. It just means that when we do so, we want to find and isolate two different market forces. To give you an example about what that would look like, we can think of what would happen to the market price and quantity of postal mail when A, the payroll for the USPS would increase, and B, there is a decreasing volume of snail mail. Now, something that I learned about the United States Postal Service this year is that, yes, they operate largely at a loss and are not profitable, but while I thought I knew that in the past, I thought that was due to email and digital mail replacing physical mail, that less people relied on the United States Postal Service now. That couldn't be more wrong. What's driving the lack of profitability of the United States Postal Service is this archaic punitive rule from 2006, which was just meant as a way to punish, as like a political weapon, to require the United States Postal Service to pay their employee retirement benefits 50 years in advance, to fund them in advance. And so they take revenue which they could be using to be more profitable at a current period and are putting it way into the future. And so that's just, I think, something that is often overlooked. And when we think about the economics of postal mail delivery, is something that we should keep in mind. So to analyze this problem, to get back to the task at hand and think about how we consider a change in two curves at once, our first step is still the same. We want to draw the initial supply and demand conditions. We have price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, an initial equilibrium quantity, an initial equilibrium price. Now, we then want to isolate one of these market factors, market forces, and so we want to think about the payroll for the USPS increasing. So is this going to impact supply or demand? Well, it doesn't impact the population of people who are likely to buy mail or pay for mail services, doesn't impact their income, related goods, expectations, etc. It makes the delivery of mail more costly. And so we know that that market force is going to impact the supply curve. Is it going to increase or decrease supply? Well, it's going to make the delivery of mail more costly, and so it's going to decrease the supply curve. So we then draw the new supply curve on the original supply and demand curve. So we have a leftward shift in supply. So we have S1. Now, before we draw the new equilibrium conditions, let's return to the prompt and think about what the other change implies. So when there's a decreasing volume of snail mail, when there's less of a preference for snail mail, is that going to impact supply or demand? Well, this is reflecting a general trend in the market towards digital media, towards digital correspondence and away from physical correspondence. So it's going to impact demand. And importantly here, it's driving demand down. And so we're going to see a decrease in demand as well. And let's draw that in a different color here. So we have demand shift to the left, demand decrease. So we'll draw D1. And now we want to find the intersection of the new supply curve and the new demand curve. So this is important to see how we illustrated the magnitude of the change in the new supply curve and the new demand curve. The way we have illustrated it, we would see the market quantity decrease significantly, and we would see the market price increase. Now you may note that if we had drawn this just a little bit differently, if we had drawn it such that, let's say, the supply curve only decreased, say decreased to this point. So it's still a leftward shift from the original supply curve. But now we find the intersection of that supply curve and the new demand curve. We still have a decrease in equilibrium quantity, but now instead of price increasing, price will decrease. So this is where how you draw these curves really matter. And what can we then say about what will happen to price and quantity in this situation? Well, we can say that unambiguously, without question, the market quantity is going to decrease. We cannot say with certainty what's going to happen to price, depending on whether the change in demand was greater, the change in supply was greater, price could go up or down. So when you think about problems where there are two changes in the curves, either a change in supply and a change in demand, then it's important to think about which direction equilibrium conditions are moving in that situation, and to then recognize that all that we can say with certainty is that an equilibrium quantity or equilibrium price is increasing or decreasing based on what is happening in the individual curve. So in this case, because a decrease in demand leads to a lower quantity and a decrease in supply leads to a lower quantity, then we know that with certainty the equilibrium quantity is going to decrease. But because the impact on price is going in two different directions, then we can't say with certainty what's going to happen to price. Okay, so as indicated previously in this video, we can use this analysis of what happens to the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in response to a change in market forces to consider what is going to happen to consumer surplus or producer surplus in response to a change in market forces. So let's start off here just with one example or illustrate how we would make this, this analysis. So under these initial equilibrium conditions, under this initial supply curve and demand curve, we have an initial consumer surplus. Say that triangle equals consumer surplus. And if we have a decrease in supply, let's see what would happen to consumer surplus. So we have supply shifting to the left from S0 to S1, and our new equilibrium conditions are going to be Q1 and P1. So we know that our consumer surplus is going to be the difference between the demand curve and the equilibrium price for the market quantity amount of units. And so we now see that our new consumer surplus is going to be that triangle. So obviously the little blue triangle is smaller than the big red triangle. So when we have a decrease in supply, that is going to lead to a decrease in consumer surplus. You could conduct this similar sort of analysis with all different types of shifts of the supply and demand curves. We have two curves and they could shift in two directions. And so you can see 4 different outcomes there. So it's going to be important to remember that a change in a market force doesn't just lead to a change in equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. It leads to a change in our measures of consumer well-being and producer well-being. So in the next couple of videos, we're going to start considering not only what forces, what market forces lead to these types of changes, but how we can think about government interventions within these markets and what impact that would have on equilibrium quantity and price and on consumer and producer well-being.